Have you ever wondered how a single moment of courage could unravel a mystery that's haunted your family for years? In today's story, a struggling single dad named Silas Reed does something that would terrify most people. He runs into a burning building to save a homeless woman named Linda Croft, who everyone else had given up for dead. What he doesn't realize is that this woman's burn scars hold the key to a tragedy that destroyed his family decades ago. When the truth finally comes to light, it's not just about heroism or second chances. It's about how fate sometimes brings the right people together to heal wounds that time alone could never mend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the pre-dawn darkness of the small apartment on Maple Street, and Silas Reed's hand shot out automatically to silence it before it could wake his 8-year-old son, Danny. 3:45 a.m., the same time every morning for the past 2 years since he'd started his job at the Brookstone Municipal Water Treatment Plant. The work wasn't glamorous, monitoring filtration systems, checking chemical levels, ensuring the town's water supply stayed clean, but it was steady. And steady was what Danny needed. Silas rolled out of bed quietly, his joints protesting the early hour and the physical demands of his double life. Days at the water plant, evenings at Thornfield Construction, doing manual labor whenever they needed extra hands. 2 jobs to keep their heads above water, quite literally, since the medical bills from Danny's pneumonia last winter had drained what little savings they'd managed to scrape together. He padded through their modest 2-bedroom apartment, stepping carefully around the scattered Lego pieces that seemed to multiply overnight no matter how many times he asked Danny to clean them up. The living room was sparse but clean, a worn sectional couch that had been a garage sale find, a television that was older than his son, and walls decorated with Danny's artwork and school certificates. Every piece of paper that boy brought home went up on the wall, because if Silas couldn't give him much, he could at least show him how proud he was. In the kitchen, Silas started the coffee maker and began the morning routine that had become second nature. Pack Danny's lunch peanut butter and jelly because it was cheap and filling, an apple, a juice box, and a note. Always a note. Sometimes it was a joke, sometimes an encouraging word, sometimes just, "Dad loves you." Those notes had started the week after Danny's mother, Sarah, had died in the car accident 3 years ago. Danny had been 5 then, scared and confused about why Mommy wasn't coming home. The notes were Silas's way of making sure his son never doubted that someone cared about him, even when that someone had to work 16-hour days just to keep them afloat. The medical bills weren't the only financial burden weighing on Silas's shoulders. Sarah's accident had happened during a period when their health insurance had lapsed. Silas had been between jobs, and they'd thought they could manage without it for a few months. They'd been wrong. The hospital bills, the ambulance, the futile attempts to save her life, it all added up to a debt that felt impossible to climb out of. Silas had considered bankruptcy, but the lawyer's consultation fee alone had been more than he could afford. Now, as he buttered toast and poured orange juice, Silas tried not to think about the envelope that had arrived yesterday. Final notice. It had said in red letters across the front, the electric company was losing patience with his payment plan. He had 2 weeks to catch up or face disconnection. 2 weeks to find $300 that might as well have been $3,000. "Morning, Gad," came a sleepy voice from the hallway. Silas turned to see Danny shuffling into the kitchen, his hair sticking up at impossible angles, clutching the stuffed bear that had been his constant companion since the accident. Danny looked so much like Sarah, the same gentle brown eyes, the same stubborn cowlick that refused to be tamed, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking about something important. "Morning, buddy," Silas said, forcing brightness into his voice. "Sleep okay?" Danny nodded, climbing onto the kitchen stool that brought him just high enough to reach the counter. "Did you pack my lunch? Would I forget?" Silas slid the brown bag across the counter. "What do you have going on at school today?" "We're doing presentations about heroes," Danny said, taking a bite of toast. "I picked you." Silas paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Me?" "Danny, I'm not." "Yes, you are," Danny interrupted with the certainty that only an 8-year-old could possess. "Mrs. Garrett said heroes are people who help others and work hard and take care of people they love. That's you." The tightness in Silas's chest had nothing to do with the coffee's heat. He reached over and ruffled Danny's hair, not trusting his voice to stay steady. "What time is your presentation?" "After lunch." "Are you gonna be able to come?" Silas glanced at the clock. He'd already used his personal days for Danny's doctor appointments. Missing work, even for something this important, could jeopardize the job he couldn't afford to lose. But the hope in his son's eyes was undeniable. "I'll see what I can do," he said, the words feeling like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. After dropping Danny off at Brookstone Elementary, Silas made the 20-minute drive to the water treatment plant on the outskirts of town. Brookstone was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual Autumn Harvest Festival, and where a single dad struggling to make ends meet wasn't unusual enough to draw much attention. That was both a blessing and a curse. People left him alone, but they also left him alone. The morning passed in its usual routine of checking gauges, testing samples, and filling out reports. Silas had always been good with his hands, good at understanding how systems worked, how to fix them when they broke down. It was honest work, necessary work, but it paid just enough to survive, not enough to thrive. During his lunch break, Silas sat in his truck in the plant's parking lot, staring at his phone. He'd been putting off calling his supervisor at Thornfield Construction about picking up extra hours this weekend. But the electric bill wasn't going to pay itself. The construction work was harder on his body, 12 hours of digging, lifting, and hauling materials, but it paid better than the plant. The problem was, weekend shifts meant less time with Danny, and he'd already missed too many bedtime stories, too many Saturday morning cartoons. As he scrolled through his contacts, looking for his supervisor's number, Silas caught sight of his reflection in the truck's side mirror. When had those lines appeared around his eyes? When had his dark hair started showing gray at the temples? At 32, he sometimes felt twice his age, worn down by the constant juggling act of single parenthood and financial survival. His phone buzzed with a text from Danny's teacher. Reminder, presentations begin at 1:30 p.m. Danny is very excited about sharing his hero project. Silas closed his eyes and made a decision that his bank account would probably regret, but his heart couldn't live without. He dialed his supervisor's number at the plant. "Hey Mike, it's Silas. I need to ask a huge favor." 20 minutes later, Silas was driving toward Brookstone Elementary, having traded a half-day's pay for the chance to see his son's face light up when Dad walked into the classroom. It wasn't a decision that made financial sense, but some things mattered more than money. Some moments couldn't be bought back once they were gone. As he pulled into the school parking lot, Silas had no idea that this afternoon would change everything. He had no idea that while he was listening to 8-year-olds talk about their heroes, a situation was developing just 6 blocks away that would test every ounce of courage he possessed. He had no idea that a homeless woman named Linda Croft was about to sleep her last peaceful sleep in the abandoned Hartwell textile mill, and that in less than 3 hours, their lives would be forever intertwined by fire, smoke, and a mystery that had been waiting 25 years to be solved. All Silas knew was that his son thought he was a hero, and for today, that was enough. The presentation had gone better than Silas could have hoped. Danny had stood in front of his 3rd grade class, clutching a poster board covered with photos and crayon drawings, and talked about his dad with the kind of pure admiration that made Silas's throat tight. "My dad works really hard so we can have a home," Danny had said in his clear, confident voice. And he always helps people, even when he's tired. That's what makes someone a hero. Now driving home through Brookstone's quiet residential streets at 3:15 p.m., Silas couldn't stop smiling. The half-day's lost wages would hurt when the bills came due, but seeing the pride on his son's face had been worth every penny. He was already planning their evening. Maybe they'd order pizza and work on the model airplane they'd been building together for the past month. Small celebrations for small victories. He was stopped at the traffic light on Elm Street, humming along to an old country song on the radio when he first saw the smoke. At first, it was just a thin gray line rising above the trees, easily mistaken for someone's barbecue or a controlled burn. But as the light turned green and he continued down the street, the smoke grew thicker, darker, more urgent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Silas turned his truck toward the source, following Cherry Lane as it curved past the residential area toward the industrial section of town. The acrid smell hit him before he saw the flames, that sharp, choking scent of burning wood mixed with something chemical and wrong. By the time he reached the chain-link fence surrounding the old Hartwell textile mill, orange flames were licking at the broken windows of the main building. The mill had been abandoned for over a decade, a casualty of jobs moving overseas and economic downturns. The city council had been debating what to do with the property for years. Some wanted to tear it down, others hoped to attract a developer to renovate it. In the meantime, it had become an unofficial shelter for Brookstone's small but persistent homeless population. Everyone knew people slept there, but city officials mostly looked the other way as long as there wasn't trouble. Silas pulled over and grabbed his phone to call 911, but before he could dial, he heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze. Somewhere inside that burning building, someone was screaming for help. 911, what's your emergency? There's a fire at the old Hartwell mill on Cherry Lane, Silas said quickly, his eyes scanning the building. And there's someone inside. I can hear them. Sir, please stay away from the building. Fire department is en route. Estimated arrival time 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Silas looked at the flames growing stronger by the second, eating through the old timber frame like it was paper. 6 minutes might as well be 6 hours for whoever was trapped inside. Sir, are you still there? Silas ended the call and jumped out of his truck. The screaming had stopped, which somehow felt worse than the noise. He ran to the fence, finding the hole in the chain link that everyone knew about, the unofficial entrance that the homeless community used. The heat hit him immediately as he got closer to the building, a wall of superheated air that made his skin prickle. Most of the structure was already lost to the flames, but the eastern wing, the old shipping area, was only partially engulfed. If someone was still alive in there, that's where they'd be. Silas grabbed his work shirt from the truck bed, soaked it with the bottle of water he always kept in his cab, and pressed it over his nose and mouth. The old loading dock door had been propped open, probably by whoever had been using the space for shelter. Smoke poured out of the opening like a gray waterfall, but underneath it, Silas could see a corridor that wasn't yet fully consumed. He dropped to his hands and knees, remembering something he'd learned in a safety training years ago: smoke rises, stay low. The heat was incredible, even at floor level. His eyes streamed tears that evaporated almost instantly. Every breath felt like swallowing fire, even through the wet cloth. He crawled forward, calling out, "Hello, where are you?" "I'm here to help." Nothing. Just the roar of flames and the groaning of timber under stress. Then from a room to his left, he heard it, a weak cough, followed by a raspy voice. "Here, I'm here." The voice was female, barely audible above the fire's rage. Silas army crawled toward the sound, his clothes growing hot against his skin. The room had once been an office. He could make out the skeleton of a metal desk and filing cabinets through the smoke. In the far corner, huddled against the wall, was a figure wrapped in layers of tattered clothing. Linda Croft wasn't what most people expected when they thought about the homeless. She wasn't elderly or obviously mentally ill. She appeared to be in her 40s, with dark hair streaked with premature gray and intelligent eyes that were now wide with terror and smoke irritation. But it was the scars that caught Silas's attention. Even through the chaos, old burn scars that covered the left side of her face and neck, disappearing beneath her clothing. "Can you move?" Silas shouted over the noise. Linda tried to stand but stumbled. "My ankle ... I think it's broken. Fell when I was trying to get out." The ceiling above them groaned ominously. They had maybe 60 seconds before this part of the building joined the inferno, consuming the rest of the structure. Silas didn't hesitate. He pulled Linda's arm over his shoulder, supporting her weight, and began the impossible journey back toward the loading dock. Every step was agony. The smoke was thicker now, the heat more intense. Linda's weight made staying low nearly impossible, but Silas pushed forward, driven by the same instinct that made him work 2 jobs, that made him pack lunch notes, that made him show up for school presentations even when it cost him money he didn't have. Some things were more important than logic or self-preservation. They were halfway to the exit when Linda collapsed completely, her legs giving out. "Leave me," she gasped. "You can still make it." "Not happening," Silas replied, shifting to lift her in his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, all sharp angles and hollow spaces that spoke of too many missed meals. The last 20 feet felt like 20 miles. Silas's lungs burned, his vision blurred from smoke and heat, but he kept moving. When they finally tumbled out of the building onto the gravel parking lot, both of them gasping and coughing. The sound of approaching sirens was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars arrived in a chaos of flashing lights and shouting voices. Paramedics immediately took charge of Linda, checking her vitals and loading her onto a stretcher. Another team examined Silas, who insisted he was fine despite the angry red patches on his hands, and the way his chest felt like he'd been breathing sandpaper. As Linda was being loaded into the ambulance, she grabbed Silas's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and her eyes, now that they weren't clouded with smoke and fear, were startlingly clear and focused. "Thank you," she whispered. You don't know what you've done." Something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, made Silas pause. There was recognition there, though he was certain he'd never seen her before in his life. But before he could ask what she meant, the paramedics closed the ambulance doors and rushed her away to Brookstone General Hospital. Silas stood in the parking lot, watching the mill burn down to its foundation, and wondered why saving a stranger's life felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. 2 days after the fire, Silas found himself standing outside room 314 at Brookstone General Hospital, holding a small bouquet of flowers from the grocery store and feeling unexpectedly nervous. He'd told himself he was just checking on Linda's recovery. It was the decent thing to do after what they'd been through together. But the truth was more complicated than simple concern for a stranger's welfare. He couldn't stop thinking about those final moments outside the burning mill. The way Linda had looked at him with such intensity, as if she were seeing something he couldn't understand. "You don't know what you've done," she'd whispered, and those words had echoed in his mind for 48 hours. What had he done, beyond what any decent person would do in the same situation? Danny had been proud beyond measure when Silas told him about the rescue, though he downplayed the danger to avoid worrying his son. "See, Dad? I told everyone you were a hero," Danny had said, and for once, Silas hadn't argued with the assessment. Maybe he wasn't a hero in the grand sense, but he'd done something that mattered. He'd saved a life, now standing in the sterile hospital corridor with its fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. Silas knocked gently on the doorframe. "Linda, it's Silas Reed. the guy from the fire. I hope it's okay that I came by. Please, come in, came the response. Stronger than he'd expected. Linda was sitting up in bed, looking dramatically different than she had 2 days ago. The layers of tattered clothing had been replaced by a standard hospital gown, and someone had helped her wash the smoke and grime from her hair. Without the dirt and fear masking her features, Silas could see that she was probably younger than he'd initially thought, maybe late 30s rather than mid-40s. The burn scars on the left side of her face and neck were more visible now. Old marks that had healed long ago but left permanent reminders of some past trauma. I brought these, Silas said, offering the flowers awkwardly. They're not much, but the room seemed kind of bare. Linda's eyes softened as she accepted the bouquet. Simple daisies and carnations. Nothing expensive, but chosen with care. They're beautiful, thank you. No one's brought me flowers in. Well, in a very long time. Silas settled into the visitor's chair beside her bed, suddenly unsure what to say. In the chaos of the rescue, conversation had been about immediate survival. Now in the quiet of the hospital room, he realized how little he actually knew about the woman whose life he'd saved. "How are you feeling?" he asked finally. "Better, much better, thanks to you." Linda gestured to her ankle, which was wrapped and elevated. "Sprained, not broken, which is good news. The doctors say I can probably leave tomorrow if I have somewhere to go." She paused, and something flickered across her expression. "Which is still being figured out." The admission hung in the air between them. Silas knew that Linda had been living at the abandoned mill, which meant she was homeless, but hearing her acknowledge it directly was different. There was no shame in her voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that spoke of someone who'd learned to navigate difficult circumstances with dignity intact. "What happened?" Silas asked gently. "I mean, how did you end up at the mill?" Linda was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the hospital blanket. "It's a long story. The short version is that life doesn't always go according to plan, and sometimes you find yourself in places you never thought you'd be." She looked up at him then, those intelligent eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "What about you? Tell me about your life, Silas Reed. Do you always run into burning buildings to save strangers?" Silas laughed, surprising himself. "Definitely not. That was a first, and hopefully a last. I'm not exactly the heroic type. I work at the water treatment plant, do some construction on the side. I've got an 8-year-old son named Danny. We live in a little apartment on Maple Street. Pretty boring stuff, really." "A son," Linda repeated, and something in her tone made Silas look at her more closely. "That must be wonderful. Tell me about him." For the next hour, Silas found himself talking more than he had to another adult in months. He told Linda about Danny's school presentation, about the model airplane they were building, about the way his son saw heroes everywhere in teachers, in firefighters, in his dad who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Linda listened with the kind of focused attention that made him feel like his words actually mattered, asking questions that showed she was genuinely interested in his life. "He sounds like an amazing kid," Linda said when Silas finished describing Danny's latest artistic masterpiece, a crayon drawing of the 2 of them fishing at the lake, even though they'd never actually been fishing together. "You're lucky to have him." "I'm the lucky one," Silas agreed. "He's been my anchor since his mom died. Don't know what I'd do without him." Linda's expression grew very still. "His mother died? I'm so sorry. How long ago?" 3 years. Car accident." Silas found himself sharing details he rarely discussed with anyone. Sarah had been coming home from her evening shift at the diner, how it had been raining, how the other driver had run a red light, how Danny had been too young to really understand what forever meant, but old enough to ask when Mommy was coming home. "That must have been incredibly difficult," Linda said softly. "Losing someone suddenly like that. It changes everything, doesn't it?" The way you see the world, the way you think about safety and chance, and whether there's any real control over what happens to us. There was something in her voice, a weight that suggested personal experience with sudden loss. Silas studied her face, noting how her hand unconsciously moved to touch the scars on her neck. "It sounds like you know something about that," he said carefully. Linda's smile was sad, but not bitter. "Everyone knows something about loss, Silas. Some of us just wear the evidence more visibly than others." Before he could ask what she meant, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Croft? Time for your afternoon medication and therapy session." Silas stood to leave, but Linda caught his hand as he reached for the flowers to move them out of the way. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the rescue, though that too. Thank you for coming here today, for treating me like a person worth visiting. You'd be surprised how rare that is." "I'll come back tomorrow if you'd like," Silas heard himself saying. "See how you're doing." Linda's smile was the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her. "I'd like that very much." As Silas walked back through the hospital corridors toward the parking lot, he realized that something had shifted during their conversation. Linda Croft wasn't just the homeless woman he'd pulled from a burning building anymore. She was someone with intelligence, depth, and mysteries that made him want to understand her story. Someone who listened to his rambling about Danny and construction work like it was the most fascinating conversation in the world. Most surprising of all, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's visit in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or checking on a patient's recovery. For the first time in 3 years, Silas Reed was curious about getting to know another adult, about the possibility that his carefully controlled world might have room for someone new. He just had no idea how much room Linda Croft would eventually need, or what secrets those carefully hidden scars were waiting to reveal. 3 days later, Silas found himself doing something he'd never imagined, helping a woman he'd known for less than a week move her few possessions into the small guest room of his apartment. It wasn't much of a room, really barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, originally intended as storage space when he and Sarah had first rented the place. But it was private, it was safe, and it was available, which seemed like 3 miracles wrapped into one practical solution. The decision had been easier than he'd expected. When he'd arrived at the hospital the previous afternoon to find Linda sitting fully dressed on the edge of her bed, clutching a plastic bag containing her few recovered belongings, the question of where she would go had hung in the air like smoke from the mill fire. The homeless shelter in neighboring Millfield was full, she'd explained without self-pity, and the waiting list for transitional housing stretched for months. "I'll figure something out," she'd said with the kind of quiet dignity that made Silas's chest ache. "I always do." That's when the words had tumbled out of his mouth before his practical mind could stop them. "You could stay with us. Temporarily, just until you get back on your feet." Linda had stared at him for a long moment, her scarred hand pressing against her throat in what he was beginning to recognize as a nervous habit. "Silas, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." And he'd meant it, even as part of his brain cataloged all the reasons why inviting a stranger into his home was potentially disastrous. But Linda wasn't a stranger anymore, not really. She was the woman who'd listened to him talk about Danny for an hour without seeming bored. She was someone who understood loss in a way that most people didn't. She was someone who needed help. And Silas had learned long ago that when you had the ability to help, you did it. Now, watching Linda carefully arrange her meager possessions in the dresser, a few changes of clothes donated by the hospital social worker, some basic toiletries, and a battered paperback novel, Silas was struck by how little space a human life could occupy when stripped down to essentials. "This is incredibly generous," Linda said, smoothing the bedspread he'd hastily purchased that morning. "I know it's not easy, taking in someone you barely know." "We'll figure it out as we go," Silas replied. though privately he was wondering what Danny would make of their new house guest. His son was adaptable. He'd had to be, given the upheavals in his young life. But this was different. This wasn't a temporary babysitter or a friend's parent picking him up from school. This was someone who would be sharing their space, their routines, their carefully constructed little world. Danny's reaction, when Silas explained the situation after school, was typically direct. "Is she the lady you saved from the fire?" Danny asked, setting down his backpack and studying Linda with the frank curiosity of an 8-year-old. "Yes, I am," Linda answered before Silas could respond. She knelt down to Danny's eye level, bringing her face scars and all into full view. "My name is Linda. Your dad was very brave when he helped me." Danny considered this seriously. "Dad says you're going to stay here for a while, if that's okay with you. I know this is your home, and I'm just a guest. Can you cook?" Danny asked. Pragmatically, Linda laughed, a sound that was richer and more genuine than anything Silas had heard from her in the hospital. "I can cook a few things. What do you like to eat?" "Pancakes," Danny said immediately. "Dad makes them sometimes, but they're always kind of ... He gestured vaguely, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to describe his father's culinary limitations. "Lumpy," Silas supplied with a grin. "The word you're looking for is lumpy." "I happen to make excellent pancakes," Linda said with mock seriousness. "It's one of my specialties." And just like that, the potential awkwardness dissolved. Danny launched into an enthusiastic description of his school day, his latest Lego creation, and his ongoing campaign to convince his dad that they needed a dog. Linda listened with the same focused attention she'd shown Silas in the hospital, asking follow-up questions and responding to Danny's stories with genuine interest. Over the next week, Linda settled into their routines with an ease that surprised all of them. She was up early, quietly starting coffee and preparing Danny's lunch before either of them had fully awakened. She never presumed to take over completely. She always asked before using ingredients or rearranging anything. Her presence made their morning smoother, less rushed. The pancakes, as promised, were excellent. Fluffy and golden, served with real maple syrup that Linda had somehow procured despite her limited resources. Danny declared them the best pancakes in the history of pancakes, a pronouncement that made Linda beam with pride. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Silas asked one evening as Linda prepared a simple but delicious dinner of chicken and vegetables. "My grandmother," Linda replied, her voice taking on a softer tone. "She believed that cooking was an act of love, that every meal should be prepared with care and attention. She taught me that the quality of ingredients mattered less than the intention behind the preparation. It was the most personal thing she'd shared about her past, and Silas found himself wanting to know more. But Linda had a way of deflecting deeper questions, of redirecting conversations away from her history and toward the present moment. She was more interested in hearing about Silas's work, Danny's school projects, their plans for the weekend. The neighbors on Maple Street, a collection of working families and retirees who generally minded their own business, seemed to accept Linda's presence without much comment. Mrs. Patterson from next door, a widow in her 70s who had occasionally watched Danny in emergencies, stopped by with a casserole and a not-so-subtle desire to meet their houseguest. "Terrible thing about that fire," Mrs. Patterson said, studying Linda with the sharp eyes of someone who'd lived long enough to assess people quickly. "Lucky you were there, Silas. Some folks might have just driven on by." "Your neighbor is a good man," Linda replied simply. "I'm grateful he stopped." Mrs. Patterson's assessment must have been positive, because she left with an invitation for Linda to join her for coffee sometime, an offer extended to few of the building's residents. It was Danny who provided the most telling indication that Linda's integration into their lives was successful. 3 days into her stay, Silas came home from work to find them at the kitchen table, Linda helping with homework while dinner simmered on the stove. Danny was explaining a math problem with the kind of animated gestures he usually reserved for his most exciting discoveries, and Linda was following along as if third-grade arithmetic was the most fascinating subject in the world. "She's really good at helping with the hard problems," Danny confided to his father later that evening. "And she doesn't get impatient when I don't understand something right away." That night, as Silas lay in bed listening to the quiet sounds of Linda moving around the kitchen cleaning up, preparing for the next day, he realized how much lighter their home felt with another adult presence. Not just because of the practical help, though that was significant, but because of something harder to define. Linda brought a sense of calm competence, of someone who'd learned to find grace in small domestic rituals. But even as he appreciated her contributions to their daily life, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that there were layers to Linda Croft that remained hidden. Sometimes he caught her staring out the window with an expression of profound sadness. Sometimes she touched her scars absently, as if remembering something painful. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she studied Danny with an intensity that seemed to go beyond normal fondness for a sweet kid. There was a story there, Silas was certain. A story that explained how someone with Linda's obvious intelligence and capability had ended up sleeping in an abandoned textile mill. A story that connected to those scars she carried, and the careful way she avoided talking about her past. He just didn't know yet how much that story would change everything he thought he knew about his own life. 2 weeks into Linda's stay, Silas began noticing things that didn't quite add up. Small things at first, the way she automatically sorted their mail by type and urgency, arranging bills in order of due date without being asked. The way she'd glanced at his truck's engine when it started making an odd noise and immediately diagnosed a loose belt tension issue that proved exactly right. The way she'd helped Danny with a school project about local history and somehow knew details about Brookstone's founding that Silas was certain weren't taught in elementary school. "How did you know that the original textile mill was built by the Hartwell family in 1892? Silas asked one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. Danny's teacher was impressed when he included that information. Linda paused in her dishwashing, her hands growing still in the soapy water. I must have read it somewhere. Maybe at the library when I was researching places to stay." But her hesitation was telling, and Silas had spent enough time with people who were hiding things, including himself during the worst months after Sarah's death, to recognize the careful construction of that answer. The inconsistencies multiplied. Linda mentioned offhandedly that the hospital's 4 technique could have been improved, then quickly changed the subject when Silas asked how she'd know that. She critiqued a news report about municipal water quality with the kind of technical precision that suggested formal training, then deflected when he pressed for details about her background. Most puzzling of all was her reaction to anything related to the Reed family history. When Danny brought home a family tree assignment and mentioned that his grandfather had died before he was born, Linda's face went completely white. When Silas mentioned that his father had been a firefighter who'd died in the line of duty 25 years ago, Linda excused herself so abruptly that she knocked over her coffee cup. "Are you feeling okay?" Silas had asked, finding her in the bathroom, gripping the sink with both hands. "Fine," she'd whispered. "Just..." Sometimes certain subjects bring back difficult memories. But when she'd returned to the living room, Silas had caught her staring at the old framed photo on the mantel, the one picture he kept of his father in his firefighter's uniform, taken just months before the warehouse fire that claimed his life. Linda had looked at that photograph with an expression of such raw pain that Silas had felt like an intruder in his own home. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning when Danny woke up with a fever and complained that his throat hurt. Silas was debating whether to take him to urgent care when Linda appeared in the doorway, took one look at Danny's flushed face and glassy eyes, and immediately moved into action. "It's probably strep," she said, gently feeling the lymph nodes in Danny's Neck, see how swollen these are. And the way he's avoiding swallowing, classic presentation. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a warm salt water gargle. Children's ibuprofen measured to the exact milligram based on Danny's weight, and a makeshift humidifier created from a bowl of hot water and towels. How do you know all this? Silas asked, watching her work with the efficiency of someone who'd handled medical emergencies before. Linda froze, realizing what she'd revealed. I used to help take care of my younger brother when he was sick. You pick things up, but there was no brother mentioned in any of the carefully vague stories she'd shared about her past. And the way she'd calculated dosages, assessed symptoms, even the medical terminology she'd used, it all suggested formal training, not just experience with a sick sibling. Later that afternoon, after the urgent care visit had confirmed Linda's diagnosis and Danny was resting comfortably with antibiotics, Silas found himself studying their houseguest with new eyes. She was reading one of Danny's books to him, her voice gentle and soothing. But Silas noticed things he'd missed before. The way she held herself, with a posture that suggested confidence despite her circumstances. The way her vocabulary occasionally slipped into more formal register before she caught herself and adjusted back to simpler phrasing. Most telling of all were her hands. Now that he was really looking, Silas could see that beneath the roughness of recent hardship, Linda's hands showed signs of a different kind of life. Her nails were short but well-shaped, not bitten or torn. There were calluses, but they were in places that suggested tool use and careful work, not the random wear patterns of someone who'd been living rough for years. That evening, after Danny had fallen asleep, Silas decided to try a different approach. Linda, he said as they sat on the small balcony outside the kitchen, sharing a cup of tea in the cool night air. I want you to know that whatever your story is, it doesn't change the fact that you're welcome here. But I also want you to know that I can tell there's more to it than you've shared. Linda's hand went immediately to her throat, tracing the edge of her scars. What do you mean? I mean that you diagnosed Danny's strep throat faster than most doctors would have. I mean that you know things about this town's history that aren't common knowledge. I mean that you look at that photo of my father like you've seen him before. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. When Linda finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Some stories are dangerous to tell, she said. Some truths hurt. More than lies, and some secrets. Some secrets are kept to protect people, not to deceive them. Who are you protecting? Silas asked gently. Linda turned to look at him then, and in the dim light from the kitchen window, her scars seemed to tell their own story of pain and survival. Maybe you, she whispered. Maybe Danny, maybe myself. From what? But Linda was already standing, collecting their empty cups. From the past, she said simply. From things that can't be changed no matter how much we wish they could be. As she disappeared into the kitchen, Silas remained on the balcony, staring up at the star-filled sky and trying to piece together the puzzle that Linda Croft had become. Every answer she gave only raised more questions. Every small revelation about her capabilities only highlighted how much she was hiding. But most unsettling of all was the growing certainty that whatever Linda's secret was, it wasn't just about her own past. The way she'd reacted to mentions of his father, the intensity with which she'd studied that photograph, the careful way she sometimes watched Danny when she thought no one was looking, it all pointed to something personal. Something that connected her story to theirs in ways Silas couldn't yet understand. He thought about the scars on her face and neck, clearly from burns, clearly old. He thought about his father, who died fighting a warehouse fire 25 years ago. He thought about the way Linda had whispered, "You don't know what you've done," after he'd pulled her from the burning mill. As the pieces began to form a picture too terrible to fully consider, Silas felt the first cold touch of real fear. Not fear of Linda herself, she'd proven herself trustworthy in every way that mattered, but fear of what truth might be hiding behind those carefully guarded eyes, and what that truth might mean for the fragile piece they'd all found together. In the kitchen, he could hear Linda moving quietly around, preparing for another day of the carefully constructed normal life she'd helped them build. But now Silas wondered if that normalcy was built on foundations that were about to shift in ways none of them were prepared for. The discovery came by accident, the way most life-changing moments do, not through careful investigation or dramatic confrontation, but through the mundane act of Danny spilling juice on his homework and needing to reprint a page from the computer. It was Sunday morning, 3 days after their conversation on the balcony. Linda had taken Danny to the park while Silas caught up on bills and household tasks. Danny's family tree project was due Monday, and when the orange juice incident occurred, Silas offered to help reprint the page about local heroes that Danny had researched for the community connections portion of his assignment. The file was still open on their old laptop, and as Silas scrolled through Danny's research, he found himself reading about Brookstone's most decorated firefighters. There was Captain James Morrison, who'd served for 30 years. Lieutenant Patricia Valdez, who'd been the first female firefighter in the department. And there, in a section about firefighters who died in the line of duty, was his father's name, Thomas Reed, age 34, died August 15, 1999, in the Millfield Industrial Warehouse. Fire while attempting to rescue civilians trapped in the building. Silas had read those basic facts countless times over the years, but Danny's research had uncovered additional details that Silas had never known. Details about the specific circumstances of that night, information that had apparently been archived in old newspaper reports that were now digitized and searchable. The warehouse had been an illegal boarding house, crowded with people who had nowhere else to go. The fire had started in the electrical system, spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. 7 people had been trapped on the upper floors when the staircase collapsed. Thomas Reed had made multiple trips into the building, saving 6 people. Before the roof caved in during his final rescue attempt, the 7th person, the one he'd died trying to save, was identified as Linda Croft, age 17, who had suffered severe burns but survived. Silas stared at the screen, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. Linda Croft, age 17 in 1999, which would make her 42 now. The same Linda Croft who was at that moment pushing his son on the swings at Willowbrook Park. The same woman who'd been making them breakfast every morning for the past 3 weeks. With shaking hands, he clicked through more archived articles, finding additional details that painted a picture of that terrible night. Linda Croft had been living in the warehouse after aging out of foster care. She'd been trapped on the 3rd floor when Thomas Reed had found her, unconscious from smoke inhalation and badly burned. He'd managed to get her to window and pass her down to other firefighters before going back for one more sweep of the building. That's when the roof had collapsed, trapping him under burning debris. The articles described Linda's injuries in clinical terms. 3rd-degree burns over 30% of her body, smoke inhalation damage, multiple surgeries. But they also noted something else. After her recovery, she'd disappeared from public view completely. No interviews, no appearances at the memorial service for Thomas Reed, no contact with the fire department that had tried to honor her as the person Thomas had died saving. The last article was dated 2 years after the fire. A follow-up piece wondering whatever had happened to the young woman, whose life had cost a hero his own. The reporter had been unable to locate Linda Croft for comment. Now Silas knew why. She'd been carrying the weight of his father's death for 25 years, believing herself responsible for the loss that had shaped Silas's entire life. She'd been living with the knowledge that every morning he woke up without a father, every milestone Danny would never share with his grandfather, every struggle they'd faced as a family, all of it traced back to that terrible night when she was 17 and trapped and terrified. When Linda and Danny returned from the park, laughing about something that had happened on the playground, Silas was sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop still open in front of him. Linda took one look at his face and went very still. "Danny," she said quietly, "why don't you go start on your other homework? Your dad and I need to talk about something." Danny, with the intuitive sense that kids develop when adults need privacy, grabbed his backpack and disappeared into his room without argument. Linda approached the table slowly, her eyes fixed on the computer screen. When she saw the newspaper archive displayed there, her legs seemed to give out, and she sank into the chair across from him. "You know," she said simply. "Linda Croft," Silas said, his voice hoarse, "age 17. The girl my father died trying to save." Linda's hands were shaking as she brought them to cover her face. "I tried to tell you," she whispered. "That first night in the hospital, when you said your name was Reed, I thought I was going to be sick. And then when you mentioned your father, when you said he'd been a firefighter." She looked up at him with eyes filled with 25 years of pain. "I should have left immediately. I should never have come here." "Why didn't you?" Silas asked. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because I was selfish," Linda said, her voice breaking. "Because for the first time in 25 years, I was part of a family again. Because Danny reminded me what it felt like to be useful, to be wanted. Because you made me feel like I might actually deserve to be saved." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of all those years of guilt and grief colliding in the space of their small kitchen. "You were 17, Silas said finally. "You were a kid with nowhere else to go, living in a fire. Trapped because you had no other choice. You didn't kill my father, Linda. The fire did." "He died because of me," Linda insisted. "He'd saved everyone else. He was almost out when he heard me calling for help. If I'd been braver, if I'd found another way out, if I'd never been there in the first place, if, Silas interrupted, leaning forward. "I've spent 25 years thinking the same things. If he'd been more careful, if he'd waited for backup, if he'd made different choices. But the truth is, my father died doing exactly what he'd trained to do, what he'd sworn to do. He died saving someone's life. He died saving your life." Linda was crying now, silent tears streaming down her scarred cheek. "I've tried to make it worth something," she whispered. "After I recovered, I went to nursing school, then medical school. I spent 15 years working in trauma centers, trying to save other people the way he saved me. But I couldn't save everyone, and eventually the weight of it broke me. I lost my practice, lost my home, lost everything because I couldn't stop seeing his face every time someone died on my watch." The pieces clicked together for Silas: the medical knowledge, the precise diagnoses, the way she'd known exactly how to care for Danny when he was sick. Dr. Linda Croft, trauma surgeon, who'd destroyed her own life trying to live up to the sacrifice his father had made. "So you ended up homeless," Silas said softly. "I ended up where I thought I belonged," Linda corrected. "Living in abandoned buildings, sleeping rough, trying to disappear completely. And then you pulled me out of another fire, and it felt like some kind of cosmic joke. Thomas Reed's son, saving the woman who got his father killed." "No," Silas said firmly. "It felt like my father's son, saving someone who needed saving. It felt like doing what he would have done." Linda looked at him with something like wonder in her eyes. "How can you not hate me?" Silas stood up and moved around the table, kneeling beside her chair. "Because hating you wouldn't bring him back. Because you've spent 25 years punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Because ... He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Because I think my father would be proud that his sacrifice led to the woman who's been making my son pancakes and helping him with his homework and making our house feel like a home again." Linda's composure finally broke completely, and she sobbed with the force of 25 years of carried grief. Silas held her while she cried, thinking about the cruel mathematics of fate, how his greatest loss had become her greatest burden, how they'd found each other across all those years of separate suffering, how sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who need our forgiveness most desperately. Outside, the world continued its normal Sunday rhythm, but inside their small apartment, two damaged people began the long work of healing from a shared wound that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The first 3 days after the revelation were the strangest of Silas's life. Linda moved through their routines with careful precision, making breakfast and helping Danny with homework as if nothing had changed. But there was a fragility to her movements now, like someone walking on ice that might crack at any moment. She'd offered to leave twice, once that same Sunday evening and again Monday morning, but Silas had refused both times. Where would you go? He'd asked when she'd brought it up again while folding laundry. Back to sleeping in abandoned buildings? Back to running from something that happened when you were barely older than Danny is now. Linda's hands had still done one of Danny's school shirts. It doesn't feel right, staying here, knowing what I cost you. What I cost him. She gestured toward Danny's room, where he was building something elaborate with Legos. What you cost us. Silas had set down the bills he'd been sorting and really looked at her. Linda, you didn't cost us anything. You're the reason my father's death meant something. You're the proof that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. But he could see that his words weren't reaching her, not really. 25 years of self-blame wasn't going to dissolve overnight, just because he'd offered forgiveness. Linda had built her entire adult identity around the belief that she was responsible for Thomas Reed's death, and challenging that foundation meant questioning everything she'd believed about herself for longer than Danny had been alive. Wednesday evening, Silas made a decision. After dinner, he asked Linda to help him with something in the living room. Danny was at the kitchen table working on math problems, close enough to overhear but far enough away to give them some privacy. I want to tell you about my father, Silas said, settling on the couch and patting the cushion beside him. Not the firefighter who died in the warehouse, but the man who raised me. Linda sat cautiously, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He was a terrible cook, Silas began with a slight smile. Burned everything he touched. I lived on cereal and sandwiches for most of my childhood because he was too stubborn to admit he couldn't handle anything more complicated than heating up soup. But every Sunday, he'd attempt pancakes. Awful, lumpy, half-raw pancakes that we'd eat anyway because he was so proud of them. Linda's lips twitched slightly at that, and Silas felt encouraged to continue. He was also the most naturally generous person I've ever known. He couldn't walk past someone who needed help, didn't matter if it was a stray cat, a broken-down car, or a neighbor who couldn't afford groceries. My mother used to joke that he'd give away his own shoes if someone needed them more. He sounds wonderful, Linda said softly. He was, but he was also human. He made mistakes, lost his temper sometimes, worried constantly about money and weather. He was doing right by our family. The night he died, I was angry at him. Linda looked startled by this admission. We'd had a fight that morning, Silas continued. I was 7, and I'd wanted him to come to my soccer game instead of going to work. I told him he didn't care about me, that work was more important than I was. Typical kid stuff, but I was still mad when he left for his shift that evening. I never got to take it back. Silas ... Linda's voice was full of understanding pain. For years I convinced myself that if we hadn't fought, maybe he would have been more careful that night. Maybe he would have thought twice before going back into that building. Maybe if he'd known how much I needed him to come home, he would have made different choices. Linda was quiet for a long moment. What changed your mind? Growing up? Becoming a father myself. Realizing that my dad didn't die because we'd fought that morning. He died because someone needed help, and he was the kind of man who couldn't walk away from that. It's who he was, fundamentally. Whether I'd been angry at him or not, whether he'd known it was dangerous or not, he would have gone back into that building because that's what heroes do. From the kitchen, they could hear Danny's pencil scratching against paper as he worked. Through long division problems. "Your father died saving me," Linda said, her voice barely audible. "How can you look at me and not see the reason he's gone?" "Because I don't see the reason he's gone," Silas replied firmly. "I see the reason he lived. I see the person whose life validated every choice he made to become a firefighter, every risk he took, every time he put himself in danger to help someone else. You're not my father's failure, Linda. You're his success story." Linda's breath caught, and she pressed her scarred hand against her throat. "I destroyed everything," she whispered. "I had a good life after the fire. I became a doctor. I helped people. I had a house and a career and respect. And I threw it all away because I couldn't handle the guilt." "Tell me about that," Silas said. "Gently, tell me what happened." For the next hour, Linda talked. She told him about the years of reconstructive surgery, about the physical therapy and the psychological counseling, about the foster family who'd taken her in during her recovery and encouraged her dreams of medical school, about graduating top of her class and specializing in trauma surgery because she wanted to save other people the way Thomas Reed had saved her. "I was good at it," she said, wonder in her voice as if she'd forgotten. "I was really good at saving people. For 15 years, I felt like I was paying back the debt I owed. Every life I saved was a small payment on what your father had given me. What went wrong?" Silas asked. Linda's face crumpled. "I couldn't save them all. And every time someone died on my table, every time I lost a patient, despite everything I did, it felt like I was letting your father down all over again. The guilt started affecting my judgment. I second-guessed myself, took risks I shouldn't have taken, worked too many hours trying to prove I was worthy of being saved." She described the malpractice suit that had ended her career, a case where she'd made a decision under pressure that had gone wrong, resulting in a patient's death. How she'd lost her medical license, her house, her sense of purpose. How she'd started drinking to numb the pain and eventually found herself living in the same kind of desperate circumstances that had led her to that warehouse. 25 years earlier, "I thought maybe that's where I belonged," she said. "Back where your father found me, back where the story should have ended. But it didn't end there," Silas pointed out. "You survived. You spent 25 years trying to make his sacrifice mean something. And now you're here, making our lives better in ways you probably don't even realize." "I make pancakes," Linda said with a weak smile. "You make pancakes that don't give us food poisoning," Silas corrected. "You help Danny with homework without losing patience. You sorted our bills by due date without being asked, which probably saved us from having our electricity shut off. You diagnosed Danny's strep throat faster than urgent care did. You've made our house feel like a home again for the first time since Sarah died." From the kitchen came Danny's voice. "Are you guys talking about Grandpa Thomas?" Silas and Linda exchanged glances. They'd been so absorbed in their conversation that they'd forgotten how well sound carried in their small apartment. "Come here, buddy," Silas called. Danny appeared in the doorway. Math homework forgotten, his expression serious in the way that meant he'd been listening to more than they'd realized. "Is Linda the lady that Grandpa Thomas saved?" Danny asked. With the direct clarity that only kids possessed, Silas looked at Linda, who nodded slightly. "Yes," he said, "she is." Danny considered this information with the same thoughtful expression he used when working through a particularly challenging math problem. Then he walked over to Linda and climbed onto the couch beside her. "I'm glad he saved you," Danny said simply. "Because if he didn't, you wouldn't be here to make us pancakes and help with my homework. And you wouldn't be here for Dad to save from the fire either." Linda's eyes filled with tears as Danny settled against her side with the easy affection. of a 8-year-old who decided someone belonged in his life. I think Grandpa Thomas would be happy, Danny continued with the wisdom that sometimes surprised both adults. He liked helping people, and now you help people too. It's like his helping keeps going. In that moment, sitting on their worn couch with Danny's simple acceptance, bridging the gap between past pain and present healing, Silas saw his father's legacy more clearly than he ever had before. It wasn't just about the man who died in a warehouse fire 25 years ago. It was about the chain of kindness that connected that night to this moment, how saving Linda had led to her saving others, how her presence in their lives was saving them in small but significant ways. Everyday some gifts, Silas realized, take decades to fully unwrap. But that didn't make them any less precious when they finally revealed themselves. For 3 weeks after Danny's simple declaration about his grandfather's continuing legacy, their lives settled into something that felt almost like normalcy. Linda continued making pancakes that didn't cause food poisoning, continued helping with homework and organizing bills, but there was something different now, a lightness in her movements that hadn't been there before. The careful guardedness that had characterized her first month with them had gradually dissolved, replaced by moments of genuine laughter and an ease that suggested she might finally be learning to forgive herself. Silas began to believe they'd found their rhythm, that whatever healing had started in their living room that Wednesday evening would simply continue, day by day, until the weight of the past became manageable for all of them. He should have known that healing, like everything else worthwhile, was rarely a straight line. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in early November. Silas was getting ready for work, and Linda was packing Danny's lunch when the kitchen landline rang. Linda answered it while Silas searched for his truck keys. "Reed Residence," she said, then paused. "Yes, this is Dr. Linda Croft." Something in her tone made Silas look up. Linda's face had gone completely pale, and her free hand was gripping the edge of the counter with white knuckles. "I see," she said quietly. "Yes, I understand. When would you need an answer?" She hung up and stood frozen for a moment, staring at the phone as if it might ring again with a different message. What was that about? Silas asked. Linda turned toward him slowly, and he could see she was struggling to process whatever she'd just heard. That was Dr. Patricia Hendricks from Denver General Hospital. She's the new chief of emergency medicine there. "Okay," Silas said carefully, sensing something significant was coming. "The malpractice case that ended my career was overturned last month on appeal. New evidence came to light that proved the original decision was based on incomplete information. My medical license has been reinstated." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. That's great news, right? That's what you've wanted?" "Dr. Hendricks is offering me a position," Linda continued, her voice sounding hollow. "Head of trauma surgery. It's a teaching hospital, which means I'd be training the next generation of emergency doctors. She said she's been following my case for years, that she believes I was railroaded by a system that needed someone to blame." From his bedroom, they could hear Danny singing off-key while getting dressed for school, blissfully unaware that their carefully constructed world was about to shift again. "Denver," Silas said. "Denver," Linda confirmed. "She needs an answer by Friday. The position starts in January." They stood in the kitchen, the weight of this opportunity settling between them like a physical presence. Silas understood immediately what this meant for Linda: vindication, a chance to return to the career that had given her purpose, the opportunity to save lives again in a way that honored his father's sacrifice. He also understood what it meant for him and Danny, losing the person who'd become essential to their daily happiness in ways they hadn't even fully realized yet. "You have to take it," he said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. Linda's eyes snapped to his face. "Silas, you have to take it," he repeated. "This is what you've been working toward your whole life. This is your chance to get back what you lost. What about Danny? What about you? What about everything we've built here? Silas looked around their small kitchen, at the coffee cups Linda had set out for their morning routine, at Danny's lunch packed with the careful attention she brought to everything she did for them. "We'll be okay," he said, and almost meant it. "We were okay before you came, and we'll figure out how to be okay again." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. They might survive Linda's departure, but okay was relative. They'd gotten used to her steadying presence, her quiet competence, the way she filled spaces in their lives they hadn't even known were empty. Going back to their old routines would feel like learning to live in a house with half the room suddenly sealed off. Linda studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. "I don't want to leave you," she said softly. "No," Silas replied, "but you have to. Not just for your career, but for yourself. You've spent 25 years punishing yourself for surviving. Maybe it's time to accept that you deserve to have a life that matters again." The conversation was interrupted by Danny bouncing into the kitchen, backpack slung over one shoulder, and a wide grin on his face. "Linda, did you remember to put the note in my lunch?" "Of course," Linda said, her voice carefully controlled. "What kind of note did you want today?" "Surprise me," Danny said, then noticed the strange atmosphere in the room. "Is everything okay?" Silas and Linda exchanged glances. They'd agreed early on to always be honest with Danny about the important things in age-appropriate ways, but neither of them was prepared for this conversation. "Linda got some good news about her work," Silas said carefully. "The kind of news that might mean some changes for all of us." Danny looked between them with the sharp intuition that kids develop when adults are trying to protect them from something. "What kind of changes?" Linda knelt down to Danny's eye level, the same way she had that first day when he'd asked if she could cook. "Do you remember how I told you I used to be a doctor before I lost my job?" Danny nodded. "Well, it turns out that losing my job was a mistake, and now I have a chance to be a doctor again. To help people who are hurt, the way your grandfather helped me. That's good, right?" Danny asked, but his voice had grown smaller. "It's very good," Linda agreed. "But the job is in Denver, which is far away from here." Danny was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the serious concentration he brought to difficult math problems. "Would you come back to visit?" I don't know," Linda admitted. "Denver is very far away, and being a doctor takes a lot of time and energy. So you'd leave and we might not see you again?" The directness of the question hung in the air like a challenge. Silas wanted to step in, to soften the blow somehow, but he also knew that Linda needed to answer this herself. "Danny," Linda said, her voice thick with emotion, "sometimes people have to make really hard choices. Sometimes doing the right thing means leaving people you care about, even when you don't want to." Danny considered this with the gravity of someone much older than 8. "Like how Grandpa Thomas had to leave Dad to save you?" Linda's breath caught audibly. "Yes," she whispered, "exactly like that." The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Linda called Dr. Hendricks and accepted the position, then began making arrangements to leave Brookstone. She had no possessions to pack beyond the clothes that had been donated to her, and a few personal items she'd acquired during her stay. But there were other preparations, paperwork for her medical license, travel arrangements, the logistics of starting over in a new city. Silas threw himself into work, picking up extra shifts at both the water plant and construction sites to keep his mind occupied. But in the quiet moments, driving home from work, lying in bed at night, eating breakfast without Linda's pancakes, the reality of her impending departure settled over him like grief. Danny's reaction was more complex. He continued his normal routines, going to school and completing homework and building elaborate Lego structures, but he grew quieter, more clingy. He started asking Silas to read extra bedtime stories and climbed into his father's bed during thunderstorms for the first time in over a year. Is it because I said I was glad Grandpa saved her? Danny asked one evening as Silas tucked him in. Did I make her want to leave? No, buddy, Silas said, sitting on the edge of Danny's bed. Linda isn't leaving because of anything you said. Or did. She's leaving because she has a chance to help a lot of people, and that's something she needs to do. But what if she forgets about us? Silas's throat tightened. She won't forget about us. How could she forget about the best pancake critic in Brookstone? Danny smiled weakly at that, but his eyes remained worried. Will we be okay without her? It was the same question Silas had been asking himself for 3 days. We'll miss her. A lot, he said honestly. But we'll take care of each other, just like we always have. And maybe someday we'll get to see her again. Linda left on a Friday morning while Danny was at school. Silas had taken the morning off to drive her to the bus station. A 40-minute trip that felt both too long and far too short. They didn't talk much during the drive. Everything important had already been said, and everything else felt inadequate for the occasion. At the station, as Linda's bus to Denver idled nearby, she turned to Silas with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said, for saving me from the fire. Yes, but more than that. Thank you for saving me from myself. For showing me that forgiveness was possible, that I could be part of a family again, even temporarily. Take care of yourself. Silas replied, pulling her into a hug that felt like trying to hold onto water. And Linda? My father would be proud of who you became. I'm proud of who you became. As the bus pulled away from the station, Silas stood in the parking lot, watching until it disappeared around a curve in the road. Then he drove home to an apartment that felt suddenly cavernous, to empty spaces that Linda's presence had filled. Without him realizing how much he'd needed them filled, that evening, when Danny asked where Linda was, Silas simply said, she started her journey to Denver today. They made lumpy pancakes for dinner and tried to pretend that the apartment didn't echo with her absence. But as weeks turned into a month, and November gave way to December, Silas began to wonder if they'd seen the last of Dr. Linda Croft. She'd returned to the life she was meant to live, the career that would let her honor his father's sacrifice in the way she'd always intended. Maybe that was how their story was supposed to end, with her healing and moving forward, leaving them with the memory of the time when a woman who'd lost everything had helped them remember what it felt like to be a complete family. Maybe that was enough. But as Christmas approached and their apartment stayed too quiet, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't quite finished yet. 6 months after Linda's departure, Silas Reed stood in the kitchen of their Maple Street apartment, attempting to make pancakes for Danny's 9th birthday breakfast. The batter was lumpy, just like always, but this time he didn't mind as much. Danny had stopped comparing his father's cooking to Linda's around Valentine's Day, and by Easter, they'd developed their own Saturday morning tradition that didn't require anyone's pancakes to be perfect. They're not supposed to be that color, Dad, Danny observed from his perch on the kitchen stool, watching Silas flip what could generously be called pancake. They're golden brown, Silas protested, scraping what was definitely more black than gold off the pan. That's not golden, that's burned. It's crispy, Silas corrected with a grin. Crispy is a legitimate cooking style. Danny giggled, and the sound filled the kitchen in a way that reminded Silas how far they'd come. The first month after Linda left had been difficult. Too many quiet dinners, too many bedtime stories where Danny asked when she might visit, too many mornings when Silas automatically set 3 places at the table before remembering. But somewhere around New Year's, they'd found their footing again. It wasn't the same as before Linda's arrival. Silas had learned to be more present during their conversations, to really listen when Danny talked about his day instead of just nodding while thinking about bills or work schedules. Danny had become more helpful around the apartment, taking on age-appropriate chores without being asked and showing a maturity that sometimes surprised his father. Mrs. Patterson said she saw you talking to Miss Rodriguez after school yesterday. Danny said casually, stabbing at his definitely burned pancake with more enthusiasm than it deserved. Carmen Rodriguez was Danny's third-grade teacher, a kind woman in her early 30s who'd been asking Silas increasingly personal questions during parent-teacher conferences. She was pretty patient with Danny and had recently separated from her husband. Under different circumstances, Silas might have been interested. "She was telling me about the field trip to the Science Museum," Silas said, which was true, though. Carmen had also mentioned that she was free most Saturday evenings if Silas ever wanted to get coffee. "Do you think Linda would like Miss Rodriguez?" Danny asked with the calculating expression he wore when working through complex social dynamics. The question caught Silas off guard. They talked about Linda, occasionally Danny still included. Her in bedtime prayers, and sometimes mentioned things she'd taught him, but he rarely brought her up in the context of their current life. "I think Linda would want us to be happy," Silas said carefully. "Whatever that looks like." Danny nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this answer, and returned his attention to drowning his pancakes in syrup. Later that evening, after Danny's birthday party with 3 school friends had left their apartment covered in cake crumbs and wrapping paper, Silas found himself sitting on their small balcony with a cup of coffee, thinking about the conversation with his son. Carmen Rodriguez was a good person who clearly cared about Danny. She was local, stable, available. Everything that made practical sense for a single father looking to build a stable life. But she wasn't Linda. Not that Silas was holding out hope for Linda's return. Her Christmas card had been warm but brief, mentioning that she was settling well into her new position and that Denver General's trauma unit was keeping her busy. Her signature had been professional, Dr. Linda Croft, not the woman who'd once cried in their living room while Danny offered her the comfort of his 8-year-old wisdom. What Silas hadn't told Danny was that he'd looked up Denver General's website several times over the past few months. There was a brief bio in the staff directory: Dr. Linda Croft, head of trauma surgery, specializing in emergency medicine and disaster response training. The photo was professional, clinical Linda in surgical scrubs with her hair pulled back, her scars visible but somehow transformed from marks of trauma into badges of survival. He'd also found a news article from March about a multi-car accident on I-25, where Dr. Croft had performed emergency surgery in the field, saving the life of a pregnant woman whose car had been crushed. The article quoted her saying, "Every life is worth saving, no matter the circumstances. That's what I was taught by the firefighter who saved mine." Reading those words had made Silas's chest tight with pride and something else, a recognition that Linda had found her way back to honoring his father's sacrifice in exactly the way she'd always intended. Meanwhile, 800 miles away in Denver, Dr. Linda Croft was finishing her 3rd double shift of the week, her hands steady despite exhaustion as she sutured a construction worker's lacerated arm. The trauma bay at Denver General buzzed with controlled chaos: paramedics bringing in car accident victims, nurses calling out vital signs, residents asking rapid-fire questions about treatment protocols. This was where Linda belonged, she reminded herself for the 100th time that month. This was the life she'd worked toward for 25 years, the career that justified Thomas Reed's sacrifice. She was saving lives again, training young doctors who would go on to save thousands more. The work was meaningful, necessary, redemptive. It was also lonely in ways she hadn't anticipated. Dr. Croft? Dr. James Liu, one of her most promising residents, appeared at her elbow. "The patient in bed 3 is asking for you specifically. Says you saved his daughter's life last month, and he wanted to thank you." Linda looked up to see a middle-aged man with work-calloused hands and worried eyes, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers. She remembered him. His 18-year-old daughter had been in a motorcycle accident. Massive internal bleeding, touch and go for hours. Linda had spent the night in surgery, refusing to give up when 2 other surgeons had suggested they'd done all they could. Dr. Croft, the man said when she approached his bedside, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah's doing real well now. Back in college, full scholarship maintained. I needed you to know that what you did mattered." "Thank you," Linda said, accepting the flowers with genuine gratitude. "How is she adjusting? Good days and bad days, you know. But she's got fight in her. Says she wants to be a trauma surgeon now, like the doctor who saved her life." After her shift ended, Linda sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, holding the simple bouquet and thinking about the chain of events that had led her here. A 17-year-old girl saved by a firefighter who died in the process. That girl, becoming a doctor who saved other daughters, who inspired them to become doctors themselves. The mathematics of sacrifice seemed impossibly complex when viewed from this angle. She'd been thinking about Silas and Danny more frequently lately, especially during quiet moments between surgeries or while reviewing case files in her office. She wondered if Danny still built elaborate Lego structures, if Silas had figured out how to make pancakes that didn't require scraping burned bits off the pan. She wondered if they thought about her at all, or if their lives had simply flowed back into the patterns that had existed before she disrupted them with her presence. Linda had tried dating once since, arriving in Denver. Dr. Michael Chun, an orthopedic surgeon who was kind, intelligent, and persistently interested in getting to know her better. The dinner had been pleasant, the conversation engaging, but Linda had found herself comparing everything to evenings spent helping Danny with homework while Silas sorted bills at the kitchen table. Michael was successful and charming, but he didn't make her feel like she belonged somewhere in the way that simple domestic moments with the Reed family had. She declined his invitation for a second date, claiming that she was too focused on her career to pursue a relationship. It wasn't entirely untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that Linda had discovered something about herself during those months on Maple Street. She was capable of love that went beyond guilt and obligation. She was capable of being part of a family in ways that had nothing to do with paying back debts or earning redemption. The question was whether she could find the courage to admit that leaving Denver might be necessary for her healing, just as leaving Brookstone had been necessary for her career. 2 weeks later, Linda's perspective shifted again when she received a call from Dr. Patricia Hendricks about a new opportunity, a chance to establish a traveling trauma team that would provide emergency medical services to underserved rural communities throughout Colorado and neighboring states. It would mean less time in the hospital, more time on the road, but it would also mean returning to the kind of direct, immediate service that had first drawn her to medicine. It's a chance to make a real difference in places where advanced medical care isn't readily available, Dr. Hendricks explained during their meeting. Small towns, isolated communities, places where a trauma surgeon could save lives that would otherwise be lost to distance and lack of resources. As Linda listened to the details of the program, she found herself thinking about Brookstone's small hospital, about communities where a single doctor's presence could mean the difference between life and death. She thought about the chain of kindness that had started with Thomas Reed's sacrifice and wondered if maybe, just maybe, that chain was meant to lead her back to where it had begun. For the first time in months, Linda allowed herself to imagine a future that might include Saturday morning pancakes and homework help, and the particular kind of belonging that came from being exactly where you were needed most. That night, she called information and asked for the number of the Reed residence in Brookstone. She didn't call it, not yet, but she wrote it down and tucked it into her wallet next to her medical license and a faded photo from Danny's birthday party that Silas had sent with their Christmas card. Some decisions, Linda had learned, needed time to ripen before they could be acted upon. But as spring turned toward summer in Denver, she began to suspect that hers was almost ready. The knock on the door came on a Saturday morning in late June, just as Silas was attempting to make pancakes for Danny's end-of-school celebration breakfast. He'd actually gotten better at them over the past few months. They were still lumpy, but at least they were consistently edible, and Danny had stopped offering helpful commentary about their texture and color. "I'll get it," Danny called from the living room, where he was building what appeared to be a replica of the Denver skyline out of Legos, a project inspired by pictures Linda had sent in her latest letter. "Wait for me," Silas called back, wiping his hands on a dish towel. They had a rule about answering the door together, especially on weekends when unexpected visitors were usually either neighbors with emergencies or people selling something they couldn't afford. When Silas reached the living room, Danny was already peering through the peephole, standing on his tiptoes to reach it. "Dad," Danny said, his voice strange. "I think you should look." Silas bent down to the peephole and felt his heart stop. Linda Croft stood in the hallway outside their apartment, looking nervous and hopeful, and somehow both exactly the same and completely different than when she'd left 8 months earlier. Her hair was shorter, more professional, and she wore a simple blue dress that suggested success and stability. But her posture was the same careful, tentative, ready to retreat if she wasn't welcomed. Silas opened the door slowly, as if sudden movements might make her disappear. "Hi," Linda said softly, her voice carrying the same mixture of uncertainty and hope that he remembered from their first real conversation in the hospital. "Linda." Danny's restraint lasted exactly 3 seconds before he launched himself at her, wrapping his arms around her waist with the uncomplicated joy of a 9-year-old who'd missed someone important. Linda hugged him back, her eyes closing, briefly as if she were memorizing the moment. When she opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "Look how tall you've gotten," she said, stepping back to study Danny properly. "You must have grown 3 inches since I left." "Dad measured me last month," Danny confirmed proudly. "I'm almost as tall as the kitchen counter now." "What a see." "My Lego Denver? I built it from the pictures you sent." "I'd love to see it," Linda said, then looked up at Silas. "If it's okay that I'm here. I should have called first, but I wasn't sure. It's okay," Silas said quickly. "It's more than okay. Come in, please." As Linda followed Danny to examine his Lego masterpiece, Silas tried to process the flood of emotions her presence had unleashed. Relief, happiness, confusion, and underneath it all, a sense of rightness that he'd been missing for 8 months without fully acknowledging it. "This is amazing, Danny," Linda was saying, kneeling beside his construction. "Is this the hospital?" "Where I work, yep." "And that's the park where we went that day. And that's the bus station where Dad said goodbye to you." Linda glanced up at Silas at that, something unreadable passing across her face. "Your dad told you about that?" "He said it was important to say goodbye properly, even when it's hard." Danny explained with the matter-of-fact wisdom he'd developed over the past year. "But I always hoped you'd come back." "Well," Linda said, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Danny's creation, "I have some news that you might like to hear." Silas moved closer, settling into his armchair while Danny plopped down beside Linda with eager attention. "You know how I told you that being a doctor means helping people who are hurt?" Linda began. Danny nodded. "Well, there are a lot of places, small towns and rural communities, that don't have trauma surgeons nearby. When someone gets seriously injured in these places, they have to travel hours to get to a hospital like the one in Denver, and sometimes that's too long to wait." "That's bad," Danny said seriously. "It is. So my hospital is starting a new program called the Colorado Rural Trauma Initiative. We're creating mobile medical teams that travel to these smaller communities to provide emergency surgery and trauma care where it's needed most." Silas felt his pulse quicken, sensing where this might be heading but not daring to hope. Each team would be based in a central location and serve a region of small towns and rural areas within a certain radius. Linda continued, her eyes moving between Danny and Silas. The teams would include a trauma surgeon, specialized nurses, and emergency medical technicians. They'd work closely with local hospitals and first responders to provide care that could save lives that might otherwise be lost to distance and time. Like Grandpa Thomas saved people, Danny said, making the connection immediately. Exactly like that, Linda agreed, her voice soft. And I've been offered the chance to lead one of these teams. That's wonderful, Silas said, and meant it, even as his heart began to prepare for another goodbye. Where would you be based? Linda's smile was nervous but radiant. That's the thing. The program administrators want to establish teams in locations that are central to multiple rural communities, but also have existing medical infrastructure and first responder services. They want places with good people who understand the value of helping their neighbors. She paused, her eyes locking with Silas's. They want to base one of the teams in Brookstone. The silence that followed was filled with possibility and disbelief, and the sound of Danny's sharp intake of breath. You'd come back? Danny asked, his voice small and hopeful. If the community supports the program, and if you and your dad would want me back, then yes, Linda said. I'd come back. Not as someone who needs help, but as someone who can provide it. Not as a guest in your home, but as someone who chooses to make Brookstone her home. Silas felt something shift in his chest, like a door that had been carefully locked suddenly swinging open. Linda, that's incredible, but are you sure? Denver General, your position there, everything you've built. Everything I built in Denver was about proving I deserved to be saved, Linda said quietly. But living here with you and Danny taught me something different. It taught me that belonging isn't something you earn through guilt or obligation. It's something you choose, something you build with people who matter to you. She turned to face both of them fully. The truth is, I've been successful in Denver. I've saved lives, trained doctors, proven that I can do the work. But I've never felt at home there the way I felt at home here. I've never felt like I was part of something bigger than myself the way I did making pancakes in your kitchen and helping with homework at your table. But this program, Silas said, still trying to process the magnitude of what she was proposing, it would be huge for Brookstone, for the whole region. It would be, Linda agreed. We'd serve a 50-mile radius covering 12 rural communities that currently have to send trauma cases to hospitals hours away. The program would save lives, but it would also create jobs, bring resources to the area, establish Brookstone as a regional medical hub. Danny looked between them with growing excitement. So you'd live here again? And help people like Grandpa Thomas did? And make pancakes that don't taste like cardboard? Linda laughed, and the sound filled their apartment with warmth that had been missing for 8 months. I'd live here again, yes. And I'd do my best to help people. Though I should warn you, I might be traveling quite a bit for emergency calls. That's okay, Danny said pragmatically. Dad travels for work too. But you'd always come home. I'd always come home, Linda confirmed. And something in the way she said it made Silas understand that she wasn't just talking about the apartment on Maple Street. She was talking about coming home to them, to the family they'd accidentally created, and then had to learn to live without. There's one more thing, Linda said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a manila folder. The program comes with funding to establish a permanent medical facility in Brookstone. Not just an outpost, but a real trauma center that could serve the community even when the mobile teams are deployed elsewhere. She handed the folder to Silas. They're offering me the chance to design it from the ground up, to create something that would honor the kind of service your father provided: immediate, selfless, life-saving help for people who need it most. Silas opened the folder and found architectural plans, budget projections, staffing proposals, a complete vision for transforming Brookstone's small rural hospital into something that could genuinely save lives and serve the broader community. They want to name it the Thomas Reed Memorial Trauma Center, Linda said softly. If that's all right with you. Silas stared at the plans, his vision blurring slightly as the magnitude of what Linda was offering settled over him. It wasn't just her return, though that alone would have been enough. It was vindication for his father's sacrifice, a living memorial that would continue saving lives for generations to come. It was economic opportunity for their community, medical resources for their neighbors, and hope for families who might otherwise face the same impossible distances that had once threatened Linda's life. Most of all, it was proof that some stories don't end with goodbye. Sometimes they just pause long enough for everyone involved to grow into the people they need to be for the next chapter. "Yes," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes to all of it. The center, the program, you coming home, all of it." Danny whooped with joy and threw himself at Linda again, and this time she held on tight, her own tears falling freely as Silas watched them embrace. He realized that Linda had done something he'd never thought possible. She'd found a way to transform her survival guilt into service, her gratitude into action, her need for redemption into a gift that would keep giving long after all of them were gone. His father's sacrifice had saved one 17-year-old girl. That girl had grown up to become a doctor who saved hundreds of lives. And now she was coming home to create something that would save thousands more. Some gifts, Silas reflected, took decades to fully reveal their true value. But when they did, they were more magnificent than anyone could have imagined. 2 years later, Silas Reed stood in the lobby of the Thomas Reed Memorial Trauma Center, watching his 11-year-old son give a guided tour to a group of visiting medical students from Denver General. Danny had appointed himself unofficial ambassador of the facility, and his enthusiasm for explaining every piece of equipment and every life-saving procedure was infectious. "And this is where Dr. Linda performs emergency surgery," Danny was saying, gesturing toward the state-of-the-art trauma bay visible through the glass walls. "She saved Mrs. Henderson's life right here last month when she had a heart attack at the grocery store. The ambulance got her here in 4 minutes instead of the 2 hours it would have taken to get to the city." Through the window, Silas could see Linda working with her team, training local paramedics on advanced trauma protocols. She moved with the confident efficiency of someone who'd found exactly where she belonged, her scarred hands steady as she demonstrated life-saving techniques that would ripple out through the entire region. The trauma center had exceeded everyone's expectations. In its first year of operation, the facility had handled over 300 emergency cases that would previously have required dangerous transport to distant hospitals. 17 lives had been definitively saved by the reduced response time, and countless others had benefited from the advanced care now available in their own community. More than that, the center had transformed Brookstone itself. New families had moved to town to work at the facility. Local businesses had expanded to serve the increased population. The high school had added advanced science courses to prepare students for medical careers. What had started as one woman's desire to honor a firefighter's sacrifice had become a catalyst for an entire community's growth and renewal. "Dad," Danny called from across the lobby, breaking Silas from his thoughts. "Come tell them about Grandpa Thomas." Silas joined the group, smiling as he always did when asked to share his father's story. It had become a regular part of the trauma center's orientation for new staff and students, not just the medical details of that warehouse fire 25 years ago, but the human story of how one man's courage had created an unbroken chain of healing that continued to this day. "My father believed that every life was worth saving," Silas told the young medical students, the same words he'd spoken dozens of times to dozens of groups. He couldn't have known that saving one 17-year-old girl would eventually lead to this place, to all of you, to the thousands of lives that will be saved in his name. But that's how kindness works. It multiplies in ways we can't predict or control. One of the students raised her hand. "Dr. Croft mentioned that she was the person your father saved. What's it like, having her back in your community?" Silas glanced toward the trauma bay where Linda was laughing at something one of the paramedics had said, her face bright with the satisfaction of work that mattered. It's like watching a circle complete itself, he said. She came back not because she owed us anything, but because she chose to build something meaningful with people she cared about. And that choice has made all the difference. That evening, as the three of them sat around the dinner table in their new house, a larger place they'd bought together 6 months ago, Danny shared the highlight of his day. One of the medical students said she wants to be a trauma surgeon because of Dr. Linda's story. He announced between bites of Linda's perfectly non-lumpy pancakes, which had become their Tuesday tradition. She said knowing that someone could survive something terrible and then spend their whole life helping other people made her want to do the same thing. Linda reached across the table to squeeze Danny's hand. "That's the best compliment anyone could give me." "It's also exactly what your grandfather would have wanted," Silas added, catching Linda's eye across the table. "His sacrifice inspiring someone else to dedicate their life to saving people." Later, as they cleaned up the dinner dishes together, a domestic ritual that had become precious to all of them, Linda paused in her drawing to look around their kitchen. The space was filled with evidence of their shared life. Danny's artwork on the refrigerator, Silas's work schedule stuck to the bulletin board, Linda's medical journal stacked on the counter next to children's library books. "Do you ever think about how different everything could have been?" she asked quietly. "You mean if you hadn't been in that warehouse? If my father hadn't tried to save you?" Silas considered this. "Sometimes. But then I think about all the people who are alive today because you became a doctor. All the families in this region who don't have to worry about getting emergency care. All the medical students who'll be inspired by your story to save lives themselves." He moved to stand beside her at the window, looking out at the lights of Brookstone twinkling in the darkness. "I think about how many ways that one terrible night created beautiful things, and I can't imagine wanting any of it to be different." Linda leaned against his shoulder, and for a moment they stood in comfortable silence, watching their town continue its evening rhythms around them. "Your father would be proud," she said finally. "I know," Silas replied. "And he'd be grateful that his son found someone who understands that the best way to honor a hero's sacrifice is to keep saving people, one life at a time." As the stars emerged over Brookstone, the Thomas Reed Memorial Trauma Center stood ready for whatever emergencies the night might bring, its lights a beacon of hope for anyone who needed saving. And in a house not far away, three people who'd found each other across decades of pain and healing slept peacefully, knowing that some stories never really end. They just keep growing, one act of kindness at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.